The session will have 4 speakers: Emiliano Veronesi, Chris Cowie, Chris Thompson and Andrew Hutchinson, and we will hear from all 4 of them, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and that will take us up to morning tea at 10 o'clock. And Chris Thompson is going first. Chris.
Do we have the pointer?
We've got a pointer.
Should be up on the LinkedIn. Yeah, the big green button.
Big green button. Oh, okay. All right, good morning everyone. I'm Chris Thompson. I'm the General Manager of Bioforce. For those of you who don't know what we do, we produce beneficial insects for a number of horticultural crops, including tomatoes. So our journey here begins around 16 years ago, when times were actually quite good. Tomato prices were about the same as now. Labour was available, energy was affordable, and none of us really had to care what a tomato potato psyllid even was. Rolling into the summer of 2005, a very newbie tomato grower out West Auckland called my father because his plants were turning yellow and there were strange little black things flying around in his greenhouse. John went out there and took a look around and he's like, I've never seen these things before. Unfortunately, this was the first recorded incursion of tomato potato psyllids that were carrying the bacteria-like virus-like bacteria, Libribacter, which can kill tomato plants within a matter of minutes of feeding, from what we've been told. This then took a tomato IPM program, which was marvelled by a lot, where we only needed Incasia for whitefly and some soft chemicals and BTs for caterpillars and broad mites to keep our crops under control, with numerous growers going multiple years without needing to use any ag chems. Since then, there's been numerous research projects on how do we get back on top of this. Some of them have had points where we thought we're on the right direction, and others have never even seen the light of day or even been talked about. One of the more interesting ones was Chuck Tan back in 2012, where we looked at Aureus, which is a generalistic predator from the South Island, native to New Zealand. And in Petri dishes and in cage experience, they were incredible. They would meaninglessly kill psyllids. They wouldn't even finish one and they'd move on to the next. The problem therein lied that they did not like tomatoes. They would refuse to breed, they wouldn't stick around, they wouldn't provide the standing army that we needed to prevent these waves of psyllids from coming in. So unfortunately, this product did not move on. It did, however, have some benefit in the capsicums, but again, most growers were too afraid of Libribacter. And with the criteria that we had for export to Australia, it became quite prohibitive to even try biological control, with the number of psyllids entering your greenhouse meaning that you'd need to spray the whole zone with Avid. Following on from this, after a few different attempts at various things, Lincoln University applied for some AgMart funding, and Howard and Scholler, who you may have seen before, investigated 4 different biological control agents for their effect on TPP. Lamonicus, which is a generalistic predatory mite, seemed to be quite a good winner, but again, it doesn't really like being on tomato plants, and the cost of it is just absolutely incredibly high. Clerobora, which is the ladybird you can see in there, is a very large ladybird. Its consumption of psyllids is like incredible. They just chew through them. But again, they do not like being on tomato plants. And in cage experiments, they would clear off all the psyllids. You'd come in the next day and you'd see them all wanting to fly away, stuck inside the cage. Tamarixia, which is in the wasp in the bottom corner there, was the wasp imported by Plant and Food, which is the known natural enemy of TPP. It is not particularly chemical tolerant. This has been its main concern in Mexico, where it's used in southern states of America. And its consumption leaves a little bit to be desired, so it kind of needs something else to give it a helping hand. And therein we tried angiotatus, which is the mirrored that you can see in this bottom left picture. which showed a bit of potential and warranted a bit further research because they do actually like to be on tomatoes. Through this big stage, we've actually gone through over a dozen different beneficial insects over these 16 years, taking some of these right through to commercialisation because they might be useful on capsicums or other crops, but some of these never even saw the light of day. Up the top left, there is a hook-tipped Draponacra, the variable lacewing. This one, very strong predator of TPP, very hard to breed, not particularly well established throughout New Zealand, but directly below it, the Tasmanian lacewing would be the main predator of TPP in potato crops. It is vastly spread across the nation and quite voracious. It is one that we are continuing to look at. Amongst these, there was a bunch of ladybirds, including the infamous harlequin ladybird, which is like a Roomba on a tomato plant. It will go through meticulously eating off whitefly and psyllids, and most insects will just take the top part, but not the harlequin. That will even make sure it sucks all of the meat out of all the legs that are hooked into the leaf. It makes sure there is nothing left. But given its infamous nature of getting stuck in dogs' mouths and tainting wine, it didn't seem like one that we should really push forward with, given the bad stigma around it and releasing it in large numbers. The cucumerous predatory mite seemed quite good when that was compared with Lamonicus. It was about a 5% reduction in predation, but a 20th of the cost. So it brought it into the economic territory. But again, it's not something that really liked being on tomatoes. So as you can imagine, we've been quite busy in these last 16 years with several teams working in parallel to try and find some solutions. And I'll pass you over to Emiliano to tell you what he's been up to.
Thank you, Chris. So, my name is Emiliano. I'm a PhD student at Lincoln University, and today I'm going to speak about multiple trait natural enemy to synergize biocontrol of glasshouse pest. As always, I put the real title of the presentation, but then I put the more interesting one, which is, okay, I've heard your PhD is about to end, but do you have something new for us? The answer is maybe. I mean, I've been busy. I've been rocking at the South Island dance competition, learning new rules about driving here in New Zealand, which apparently is different from Italy, and do some cave streaming, but also playing around with the angiotatus Chris provided us, translating books, doing some experiment, working on capsicum as well. But in the end, yes, I might have done some testing. So, this is the pest. Sadly, I don't have to describe it because you know it already very well. It's a serious and direct threat to Solanaceous crop. It's a vector of the bacterium Candidatus liberibacter. Pesticide approaches are failing worldwide at least. And at the moment, biocontrol helped, but it's not enough. So the aim of this work so far has been to test the efficacy of angiotatus nicotianae in preventing TPP from settling in the crop, test whether tamarixia might help angiotatus doing so, and at the very end, test if there is a synergy between angiotatus and the parasitic wasp tamarixia to help the biological control of TPP on crops that are already infested. So, what's the current state of TPP biocontrol so far in greenhouses? Well, nowadays, no biocontrol agents have been used. Why? Well, two main reasons. The first one is, as long as we use broad-spectrum pesticides, there is no biocontrol we can use. On the other hand, to be fair, biocontrol hasn't been so effective until now. Why? Well, there is a plethora of reasons. Might be because it was the wrong biocontrol agent, wrong amount, wrong use in general, lack of resources, who knows? Just, it wasn't working. So why am I speaking about a combination of biocontrol agents? Well, the point is that classic biocontrol has always been about releasing the biocontrol agent and then just wait for it to do the job. But it's not that simple. Also, if we start knowing better the biology of the agents we are using, it means we can exploit it. For instance, we have observed that tamarixia, which is the parasitic wasp again, tends to attack the latest stage of TPP, so let's say the old nymphs. On the other hand, angiotatus is more interested in the young ones. So if we make, let's say, if we use both these biocontrol agents, we are going to get a synergy. And possibly we are going to be able to attack TPP from different angles at the same time. So the state of the art is how and why angiotatus? Well, first of all, we decided to select angiotatus after a very careful screening of a lot of biocontrol agents that New Zealand has to offer. There are a lot of bugs out there that are just waiting to be selected and used. We tested its potential. The results were pretty interesting, so we decided to go further and try it on a large-scale experiment. So again, why angiotatus? It's common in New Zealand. It's a generalistic predator, so it feeds upon pretty much everything. Can sustain itself upon plant sap for a while without damaging the plant, so it means that if preys are low, it can sustain itself for a while before declining. On top of that, it's commercially available. So now, we started with Petri dish experiments, which are not very interesting, but are the first milestone to understand whether it's worth testing or not a biocontrol agent. And the Petri dish experiment returned outstanding results. So we decided, okay, let's make some investment, let's buy some big cages, and let's try to run a test with real tomato plant on a large-scale experiment. But first, these are the results of the Petri dish experiment. So first of all, the no-choice experiment, which means we did not give a choice to the bug, showed that it can feed upon all the first four stages of TPP. But it's not really interesting. The really interesting one is the one on the right, the choice experiment, which shows that angiotatus loves the young nymphs and doesn't like that much the fourth instar nymphs, which is precisely where tamarixia will play a role. So once again, possibly we have a good synergy and no competition between the biocontrol agents. Now, let's get to the cage experiments. Why a cage experiment? Well, it's more realistic than a leaf on a Petri dish, clearly. It involves whole plants, and I'm going to show you the video if the computer decides to help me with it. Yeah, there it is. Nope. I'm not sure why it's not playing. Yeah. But anyway, in the meantime, in the video, trust me, I was going to show you part of the cage experiment. I was going to show you cages in which we put TPP and nothing else, and the cages were swarming with TPP. And then cages in which we released the biocontrol agent, and the number of TPP were slightly above zero. So there was a very, very big difference in terms of presence of the pest with or without the biocontrol agent. And that's what led us to run some other experiment. Anyway, this is the design of the experiment. So we purchased 28 cages, 7 different blocks, which are these groups of 4 cages each. 4 treatments: control, nothing funny about it, just a tomato plant with nothing else. Angiotatus, because back at that time, we weren't sure whether angiotatus could have harmed the plant or not. So we tested it in the absence of prey. Like, what if angiotatus is hungry and there is no prey around? Is it going to damage the plant? The answer is no. TPP and TPP plus angiotatus. Now, the results were outstanding. Like in the cages with the angiotatus only, plants were just fine, totally undistinguishable from controlled plants. In the TPP cages, plants were well, very unhappy, to say the least. In the cages with TPP and angiotatus, well, something very interesting happened because angiotatus managed to, let's say, wipe away TPP in 4 cages out of 7. These results were so nice, we couldn't believe it. So we decided to run another experiment. But in the meantime, this is the data. So, like, this is the number of leaves with TPP, eggs, or nymphs. As you can see, the presence of angiotatus in the orange line made a huge difference. And once again, this is a more interesting graph, in my opinion. The number of eggs and nymphs, so the number of TPP, the number of pests. And as you can see, again, the presence of the biocontrol agent played a huge role in reducing the amount of TPP. But then we ran the second experiment, and the results were even better. We had 14 cages in which we put the biocontrol agent and the pest, and in 11 out of 14, at the end of the experiment, TPP numbers were 0. Again, this is the difference in terms of number of leaves with TPP, but the most interesting one is this one. This is the difference between eggs and nymphs, so again, young TPP, between the presence or the absence of angiotatus. And again, I think that these numbers are, well, as good as pesticides one, honestly, in my opinion. But now, some of you might already have seen my previous presentation and could think, okay, that's very interesting, but we saw it already. What's new? Well, finally, we managed to do the last experiment. So we treated with a combination of TPP and tamarixia plants that were already infested with TPP, because so far we used the biocontrol agent angiotatus according to his biology, which suggests that it's a very good agent in terms of prevention. If you manage to have the agent established in your crop before TPP's arrival, then it's definitely going to play a role. But we were also wondering, okay, but what if I already have TPP? Is there something I can do? Yes. So apparently, a combination of angiotatus and tamarixia can play a role even in those crops in which TPP presence is already there. So this is the difference in terms of number of leaves with TPP. The red line shows the effect of TPP alone. The orange line shows the effect of angiotatus. So as you can see, angiotatus played a role in reducing the number of leaves with TPP. But if we pair angiotatus and tamarixia, we get to the yellow line, and again, the results are remarkable. Same goes for the eggs. This is just about TPP eggs. As you can see, the growth of TPP eggs in the red line, which is only TPP, no biocontrol agents there, it's pretty linear. The growth of TPP eggs when just angiotatus is present is way lower than that. But if we add tamarixia, we can push it even further. And this is about the number of nymphs. Same thing, angiotatus played a role, but once again, if we add tamarixia to angiotatus, the results are outstanding. And this is about the adults. Again, same thing. Apparently, there is a pattern there. So right now, we are testing other things, such as whether the presence of Trichoderma can help tomato plant to, let's say, face the stress of Libribacter and Psyllid yellow in general. And also, I mean, it's rather complicated. Apparently, Trichoderma is able to enhance plant defenses. One of these defenses is when an herbivore attacks a plant, plants will release volatile compounds that basically are screaming in the air, hey, there is an herbivore on me. So if you're a predator, you should come. Also, we are testing a combination of angiotatus plus Encarsia formosa to test whether it's going to play a role in whitefly management. Because, breaking news, angiotatus feeds on whitefly as well. Now, I want to stress out one important thing, because in my experience, a lot of times people think that when the plant turns yellow and you have psyllid, it's because of Libribacter. It's not always the case. The presence of TPP will cause your plants to turn to yellow regardless of whether the psyllid is hot or not. The toxins inside the psyllid saliva is what cause the plant to turn to yellow. So how do we know if your psyllid is hot or not? Well, there is a way. This little box there is called BioRanger, and it's basically a portable PCR machine. It's a small device like this that you can bring on the field. It has its own battery, and it allows you to run a test, a PCR, and basically understand whether your sample, it can be a psyllid or a piece of tomato, it doesn't matter. It's hot, so it's positive or not. This is, in my opinion, extremely important because what you need to do can change a lot if your plants are hot or not. So it's important to know whether you are facing, let's say, normal psyllid or positive psyllids. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Chris Cowie, the grower manager at T&G in Reparoa, and have been so since 2018. My role in this project, if you can call it that, is converting Emiliano science into a bit of commercial reality on our commercial glasshouse properties. So I'm the grower at T&G in Reparoa, that's 5 hectares. And the key thing for me is it's not just about TPP control. You cannot have TPP psyllid control without whitefly control. They're kind of interchangeable because if one loses control, you have to spray one, which knocks out the beneficial for the other. So that's really why I got interested in India Tardis. This graph you see on the screen here is from Iraq. It scares the shit out of me. Main reason being that we can see after 8 years that insecticide resistance becomes exponentially worse. So a lot of our agrochems potentially lose a significant amount of the effect after 8 years. The key one there is transform for our whitefly control. So in 2014-15, which was my first year in the industry, I remember driving around Tuakau, Pukekohe at night with whitefly in the lights. It was horrid. And then came Transform, and it broke the cycle. It was a circuit breaker. It kind of took people's mind away from the problem because all of a sudden we had an agrochemical which just knocked things out. And we lost, in my opinion, a bit of focus around the biological control we should be targeting. So the thing with Transform is it came out in 2015 and it's now 2021, which is 6 years. And if you look at that graph previously, we're probably 2 years away from having some exponential problems with resistance on Transform. So that's really piqued my interest in how we can look at India Tardis as a whitefly control and not just for TPP. So this is the glasshouse which I run. It's been in T&G's ownership since 2015. In that time we've had a mixed history with whitefly and a less so history with TPP. TPP has had 2 incursions in the last 2 years with very minimal effect on the crop. Whitefly has been a constant bugbear, especially in my growing time, and has been a real problem as we get to the later stages of the crop as generations develop throughout the plant. We have attempted to use Incasia over that time with mixed successes, but it has never lasted from the entire crop cycle. Usually a third to halfway through the crop cycle we start to lose effect of Incasia. So We got some angiotatus when I went to listen to Emiliano and Chris talk at a Horticulture New Zealand event in Cowie. I thought it'd be a great idea to have a crack, because what's really to lose? We can still spray after all if it's not working. So in 2019-20, in the 2019 crop, we decided to release some. So we started off with planting with an IPM strategy with Incarcia and angiotatus as a mixed control method, with your yellow tape as a constant control, which we already had. The start of the crop had no detectable whitefly in the glasshouse and no TPP. From truss 1 to 15, we continue with the angiotatus at a rate of roughly 1 per 20 square metres. We also did some targeted leaf removal as a physical control, and did Oberon and NEMAQ as soft agrochemical options. We noticed at around truss 10 that the whitefly level was roughly 1 per head. From harvest truss 16 to 25, it became very clear to us that the whitefly level was not being controlled by angiotatus, and we needed to move to a weekly agrochemical application. We also did something around leaf removal, so our scouters picked up hot spots and we really removed the leaves out of that plant, taking eggs. From harvest truss 26 to 36, we really lost control of the whitefly, and it became at economically quite damaging levels. So as a first attempt, it was on a whitefly level a pretty much complete failure, but what we learned out of that was quite significant. We were pretty optimistic at the start, probably too optimistic in reality. The release strategy clearly did not develop self-sustaining angiotatus population. We know from European with similar mirrored bugs that 1 per 20 square metres is probably your ideal rate. Currently, 20 per square metres did not achieve what we really wanted to. We also learned the importance of scouting data, and I'll talk about that later on. Targeted leaf removal proved to be a huge contributing factor to controlling our whitefly that season. So the actual physical removal of hotspots really helped reduce certain peaks in the glasshouse and help with that control. All in all, because mainly that leaf removal and the extra scouting we knew about our crop, we managed to shift the peak whitefly problem 4 weeks that season with so many unanswered questions. So we really wanted to know more about release rates, and we really want to know more about what scouting we need to do. Now that's where we moved on to our Helpo. So literally 10 minutes down the road here, got our Helpo glasshouse. It's had more of a TPP problem than Reparoa, and a mixed whitefly history. Whitefly there often develops in early summer, becomes sometimes damaging economically during August. The great thing about our Helpo is, compared to Reparoa, which Reparoa is a 5 hectare singular block, where our Helpo has 2 compartments, we can do a control test V. So we did a control of angiotatus, and we did another block with just agrochemical, which is traditionally what we would do. So at our Helpo we planted, we did pretty much the same thing in terms of strategy, but we released 1 per 20 square metres, or 1 per square metre, sorry. At the start of the crop there were some detectable whitefly due to the planting date, but no psyllid. From truss 1 to 15 we did pretty much the same thing, 1 per square metre. On truss 10 we had minimal whitefly and no psyllid. From harvest truss 20 to 25, same thing. We did release some lacewings and hotspots to target it, so around the door between the control and the spray area we had a lot of whitefly incursions come in, and we used lacewings because they're so hungry to feed on those whitefly as they came through. The whitefly at this stage, and still now, is effectively less than 1 per head and under control. Traditionally, that is against the control, which is an agrochemical program which has 4 to 8 whitefly per head. So quite a remarkable difference between the control and the agrochemical program. There is, however, a significant psyllid population at our Helpo. So the TP infestation occurred in May, and it's been quite damaging to that block. So that's really where this project needs to focus going forward. We know that 1 per square metre angiotatus seems to control whitefly at a commercial scale. It's about how do we mix that with tamarixia and other beneficials to control psyllid before they become damaging. And I would relay Emiliano's point about the BioRanger. Knowing if the plant is hot makes a huge difference to what we do. Mainly because we can make a rapid decision on what to do. If you've got a hot psyllid in your glasshouse, your biological program is effectively over. It's spray time. But if you don't, there could be some better control measures. So scouting for me is one of the most important learnings I think I've had out of this 2-3 year project. When we started off, we were doing roughly 36 plants per hectare of scouting. Now we're doing 180. And when we first started, we were just doing whitefly adults and disease plants and psyllid as a scouting, what to identify. Now we're doing the nymphs of whitefly. Now we're looking at Incarcia scale to see if they have been turned black or not. We're looking obviously for TPP adults and nymphs. And we're having a really good look up and down the plant. So our scouting effort has probably doubled or trebled in that time. The key point for me is the scouting gives you a chance to make a decision on the effectiveness of your biological control program. If we biological control without scouting is like driving your car in the middle of the night with no headlights on, hoping you won't crash. You'll just end up in a hole. So if you can identify if your beneficials are working or not, it will make a decision a month or 2 months earlier on whether to stop or continue, which is very important because you can really get burnt, and trust me, I've been there. It hurts. So if there's one point that you can get out of what I've spoken about is don't try biological control without a thorough scouting program. You'll just end up being burnt. So now I'll pass to Andrew. Oh, Chris.
Good morning, I'm back again. So matching supply and demand is very important with biologicals. They're not mixed up in a matter of minutes. They're not available off the shelf at any number of our distributors. And if we don't know who you are, we don't know to plan for you. And take, for example, this sign and cost graph up here, which are inherently out of phase. If that's how we were operating, there'd be a huge part of the year the only person winning would be waste management as I throw things into the bin. And believe me, I've been there before. I stocked up very heavily for an industry that said we need more, and then they had a good year, so they took almost nothing. It was probably the worst week of my life throwing out that amount of product while giving my regulars things at 10 for 1. Just to make them happy because they're a loyal customer. The other thing we don't want happening is people calling up demanding they want things straight away when we don't have it, we haven't planned for you. Take, for example, this is the typical plan of when it comes to producing insects. We've got to sow seeds, we've got to grow plants, then we have to grow the bad bugs, then we have to grow the good bugs. So if you're a big customer, I probably needed to know 8 months ago if you were going to start. So for the likes of TNG and Hothouse and these big customers, they tell us their planting dates. They have accounts with us, so we know what to do. If it's just going to be a random phone call, we try and oblige. The smaller you are, the easier it is. But the realistic fact is that if we're not selling it, it is a perishable product. And there is a number of things you need to take into account before you can actually take ownership of your biologicals. For instance, do you have spray residues all over your plants? Are you going to put them in and have them die? this has happened to a number of customers that their nurseries have sprayed SPs or OPs, and for around about 12 weeks, nothing good is going to live in there. I've seen it with my own eyes. The pests won't care. They will happily take over your greenhouse. But anything that has a choice of wanting to be in there or not is going to leave. Have you actually taken a scout to know if you've actually got pests in there, or are you being preventative? Because then we can work on, well, how much do you actually need? Because if you just look on our website and go for the highest rate, thinking like, oh, well, they're going to come anyway, these things have a life expectancy. If there's pests there, they will start reproducing. But if there's nothing there, not many of them are going to survive. You know, they're just going to keep hunting. The lucky ones will find something, reproduce in them, or feed on them. But the bulk of them will just keep branching out, searching for things until they perish, which is why regular introductions are the key to biological programs rather than one-off big hits. For a big point is, do you actually have an account with us? I don't really appreciate getting giant orders over the phone from people I've never heard of that then I get a bollocking from our accountant because they haven't paid us for 6 months. Because I try and help people out, but when they don't help us out, it does make it hard. So if you've got an account, I can process it very easily, and especially if you told me your planting date or your expected times when you incur pests each year. And if you've got a really big house, and with some of our products, it might actually take a little bit more time to put them out than sending one guy away with a sprayer. Albeit that any one of your staff can use our product. You don't need to be a chemical handler or anything like that. Everyone can be in the glasshouse at the same time. There's no withholdings, there's no human re-entry times, you can all go and put them out. But do you actually have enough staff to put them out? Because you don't really want to receive them on a Tuesday and then sit around till next Tuesday before you put them out. It should be one of your higher priority jobs because the clock is ticking since I've dispatched them. So what we would like to see is if anyone is wanting to go this way, that they actually get in touch and we start monitoring and start building a program, working in with what products you can and can't use, because not everyone always gets the same pests, such as Chris here generally just gets whitefly. So he has a lot more options than someone who gets psyllids, and in this year there's been a really terrible problem with persistent caterpillars that have been resistant to dipel and Zentari, which has caused a few hiccups. But with this in mind, it's better to talk than to give random phone calls demanding lots of bugs, because they are perishable, unlike lanate, which can sit around for a long time. So I'll pass you over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm Andrew Hutchinson. I'm the Technical Manager at TNG Fresh's Covered Crops Division. I also represent Tomatoes New Zealand on the Industry Representative Group for a Lighter Touch program. Today I'll give you a bit of background on what is a lighter touch and briefly a summary of what agroecology is. Then I'll introduce you to the next chapter in our story. That is the Tomatoes New Zealand Model System Project, which has been put forward for a lighter touch funding. So what is a lighter touch? Well, it started back in 2015 when a group of horticultural crop groups realised that they had some shared common challenges. Number one, their available crop protection products were being phased out and banned. This was especially led by overseas companies, overseas countries where we're exporting our produce to. Two, they had limited suite of minor use registrations and an insufficient pipeline of new products to confront the resistance developing that Chris talked about earlier. And finally, it was more of an opportunity really in my eyes that we've got a growing awareness from consumers and a demand for food as free from chemical residues as possible. The Ministry for Primary Industry Sustainable Food and Fibre Futures program has brought together the horticulture, wine and arable sectors to collectively address the challenge of meeting consumer demands and the transition to agroecological crop protection programs. Government investment through this program, and industry investment I should say, will enable major challenges to be addressed and the co-investor group to achieve the scale and cohesion to operate on a whole of industry basis. And that's important. We need to operate as a whole industry for this to be successful. The program provides the stepping stone to a longer term strategic move to a less chemical dependent future. What has resulted is a lighter touch, agroecological crop protection to meet future consumer demands. We often look to Europe as a more mature market for consumer trends. Now, this branding here on the right is something I saw when I was visiting tomato growers in the south of France a few years ago. The label is used by several product groups, which can prove a 0 MRL residue for their products. Strawberries, tomatoes, potatoes, to name a few, with minimal chemical inputs, and which return a 0 residue result, are able to use this label on their packaging. It's not quite organic, and in some cases like the tomatoes, when they get to the end of the crop and they do need to intervene with chemicals, they simply stop putting that planting into that packaging and change over to a fresher crop that hasn't had chemicals applied. The label started in 2017 and has now got over 3,000 producers using this label on their packaging to differentiate their products. So you're all probably wondering, what is agroecology? It's pretty hard to say, I have to admit, but it's simply to understand and better manage the aspects of an agricultural system that directly or indirectly lead to increased levels of pests and diseases. Reducing the opportunities for pests and disease to thrive reduces the requirement for crop protection. Agroecology seeks to use the best technology available to shift the focus of crop protection and to integrate biological and ecological processes into food production, to achieve a lighter touch on the environment and also meet future consumer demands. So this leads us to the next chapter in the work described by my co-presenters today, the Tomatoes New Zealand Model System for Greenhouse Tomatoes. The vision is very, very simple: an integrated pest management program that any tomato grower can use to manage greenhouse pests. The project sets out to achieve 3 main deliverables. The first one is to establish model sites in Helpo and Reparoa, and a yet to be decided site in Tuakau. The Tuakau site is incredibly important in the fact that we have massive external pest pressures in the Tuakau region. We also have a lot of crops planted on multiple crop dates, which provide green bridges for insect populations to continue to thrive in. If this program is to be truly successful, it must be able to withstand the pressure that only a potato crop planted at vent height can apply. 2, we need to validate the work that has been done in Reparoa and Helpo with good scientific practice. There's a lot of questions raised here today actually by the guys that have presented. More questions than answers, I have to say. So the aim of this project is really to answer some of the questions around scouting best practice, economic thresholds and when we need to make these key decisions on whether to pull the pin or not, BCA application rates and timings, and finally IPM friendly crop protection products that when intervention is needed, we have opportunities. Finally, like Chris Thompson mentioned at the end there, we need to facilitate the upscaling of this arthropod BCA to enable an IPM program for all greenhouse growers to use. You saw the challenge of meeting supply and demand, and that I think would be for an established product like Tincasia. Imagine trying to meet supply and demand for something that's brand new like India Tardis that we don't really understand. So that's been deemed a big enough challenge that it's got its own project and its own work stream. So if the vision is to create an IPM program that any tomato grower can use to control their greenhouse pests and disease, the group of us would actually like to ask you guys a few questions, especially the growers in the room today. A big part of this project revolves around grower extension. There's no point in doing this if it's just going to be kept in-house. The whole point is to try and bring the industry along together with us. So how do we best get information to you, the grower? There's no point in just sending out emails that we know most people aren't going to read, because I'm guilty of that. But we're really looking for feedback on how is it best to reach you. Is it better to have workshops off-site? Is it better to have grower days and visits to the site where we actually got these programs up and running? We're really looking for feedback from you guys on that. In 4 years' time, when we're presenting this model system, what are some of the questions that you're likely to want answered before you consider this for your situation? We have got our own processes and systems at TNG that might not match some of the work that's done on your sites, so we're really keen to hear your input and questions of what might be needed to be answered before you would consider it. And what are the major barriers you see to picking up a program like this off the shelf and running with it? So we've created this nifty Gmail account there that if you do have questions or you do want to feed into this project at a later date, tomatomodelsystems@gmail.com. Please send us an email, and we'd be keen for any input to help us guide this project, because we really are just at the start of it. So on behalf of our co-presenters, I'd like to thank you for your attention today, and open the floor to any questions you've got for either myself or the guys here. Thank you.
Cheers, guys. I may be the boss of two of you, but this is a genuine question because I don't know the answer. The commercialisation of India Tardis, and how does that relate to the Elida Touch project? You know, what support does Chris need to get India Tardis at a higher commercial output level, and how can Elida Touch support that?
So it was a question. Is this on? This one is. So with this being a brand new organism, like Chris Cowie had mentioned, we still even need to know how much we need per hectare. We've been rolling through different ways of breeding them. It's not a species that's been bred anywhere in the world. So we're doing a lot of stuff in-house parallel to Elida Touch, because once we know how many we need to produce, we can map that onto our production system and start to look at how we're going to profile that through the year. Because what we'd also like to see is when people's planting dates and stuff are. These types of products are typically introduced more in the front of the season rather than trying to catch up at the end of the season. So if you're a winter planting, that's going to really help us fill in the winter demand, and if you're a summer planting, then we need to plan for that, because it's probably not going to be a flat line through the space of the year. So with this, there's a lot of inputs that really need to come from further testing before we can really pull all that together, and hence it being like a 4-year program. Okay. Any other questions?
Chris, you know, if you're using light chemicals, how often do you have to replace the beneficial insects, for example? Are they affected by the light chemicals, or how often do you get new batches in?
So for a product like Incasia, most customers would be in a weekly or fortnightly or monthly application, because that typically corresponds to how long the insect lives for. And no one really wants whitefly in their glasshouse, but they know it's going to come. So you keep replenishing the numbers as they sort of die off. Back in the good old days, or bad old days, when we left a whole lot more leaves on the tomato, then you could actually get a self-sustaining population. So once you had the pest in there, it would just work itself. Now, to maximize yield, we're stripping a lot of the lower leaves off. We get a higher yield, but we need higher inputs. So we can also help with this database information for what agrochemicals are more friendly and less friendly. We have to profile that all for angiotatus, because there's nothing known about it. But for an Incasia, there's a lot of valuable databases out there. We were quite thankful to have the Main Man product come onto the market late last year. That's actually friendly for all of our products, from what it seems. Transform's sort of okay. It's pretty hard on them, but not for very long. But if you go back to any of the SPs and stuff like that, it's really like 3 months plus that it's going to kill off any beneficial. So trying to stick with some of these newer chemicals that have got maybe a 1 to 4 week withholding is really the key to the success.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a question to Chris and Andrew. Steve used to always bang on about how great buckwheat was. And the opportunity for beneficial plants or feeding our biologicals to maintain their vigour and their lifespan, etc. How much focus in the IPM program and our understanding of Incasia do we have with respect to what we need to be doing to get the most out of it?
So for the SNAP principle of feeding the beneficials, providing shelter and all that, in a glasshouse we already have shelter, but the supplementary pollens and nectars, you can expect, say, like a 25 to 30% increase in the life of your beneficial parasitoid. So for Incasia, nominally it would last for about 3 weeks, so you could be getting closer to 4. So it does become an economic question in a greenhouse. Do you have the space? How much are these plants that I'm putting in? Are they going to get in the way? Some people have tried Phacelia and stuff and found they kind of distracted the bumblebees, which, we don't rely on honeybees in glasshouses because on a cloudy day they don't fly, whereas bumblebees are there no matter what's going on. But when they're visiting flowers they don't really have to. Is that being detrimental to your fruit set? Are you actually needing to put more hives in? So everyone's got a slightly different configuration of glasshouse. We all follow pretty much the Dutch theme, but at different ages and stages of technology. So it's going to be really a matter of your site by site. Can you fit them in? It's worth having a try. But it would be worth having a comparison, because if they're going to take up a lot of space and they're sort of adding like maybe 25% lifespan on Incasia, does it really justify it? That's something that needs to be probably done on people's sites.
You hear me? We have not really tried on the inside of the glasshouse or the outside yet. It isn't a plan for next crop to almost do a beneficial moat on the outside of the greenhouse, just so we can attract not just India Tardis but other beneficial insects which we know are most likely out there around the glasshouse, to make like a barrier between inside and out. So.
Hi guys, regards contacting us, I would prefer, say, a Facebook group where you're constantly putting pictures and little stories about what's going on, because it's easy. You just snap and then say, oh, this is what we're doing right now, and it encourages conversations. Definitely don't send us emails. One other thing, so Steve was adamant that yellow sticky traps were a bad idea, and we're constantly having this argument about whether if you put sticky traps up, you catch the predators ahead of the guys, the Incasia. But I see you're using yellow sticky traps, so how have you decided whether or not to use yellow sticky traps?
It was quite obvious from my point of view. In my first year growing at Gerrity and Tuakau, we had yellow tape on every second line and none on the other, and we had significant whitefly pressure on every second line without the yellow tape. Without the data to back it up, I wouldn't want to remove it, because it's a very risky strategy from my point of view on 5 hectares to just remove all yellow tape. from what I've seen. So for me, it's a good control unless there's evidence to back it up to say it's been a hindrance.
So we're just basing it on personal experience and guessing.
To add to that, from his yellow sticky tape and what I've seen in other greenhouses, there is definitely not a huge amalgamation of Incasia on there, and there certainly wasn't angiotatus stuck to all the yellow sticky tape either.
So that's good. So we will put them up next year.
Correct.
Any other questions?
Thanks, team, and I think the project is incredibly valuable to the industry because the available chemistry that we have now has lost its efficacy. We all know that, but and I think I might get Ben to answer the question. The upcoming chemistry is not there either, and Ben, you gave us a stat some time ago, and I think it's important to. We know that, but I think all growers need to be aware. We're on the edge of a cliff, effectively. The option of going IPM or chemical is not really an option anymore because the chemicals don't really exist in the upcoming chemistry. Ben, what is it? What's the stat?
Yes, so this was from the former general manager of Bayer in New Zealand. His commentary was that there were, it was a couple of years back, there were 5 new agrochemicals introduced in the world that year, and it just so happened that one of them was useful for whitefly from our perspective that year, but I think that sort of gives you a trend. There's Paul Munro in the room. You got any variants to that one? There ain't many options coming through, I think, is the bottom line. And the ones that we've got are becoming useless and will continue to be regulated against as well as the other side of this.
Emiliano, you mentioned Trichoderma and the plant defence system. So from my understanding with kiwi fruit, the plant defence system, we can activate it to defend against pathogens, but that then compromises its defence against biting things, pests, or we can activate it against biting pests and then that drops the defence against pathogens because of this balance. Is that something that we're going to have a problem with here, in that we've got a pathogen as well as a biting insect?
Well, that's definitely something we need to check. Like, you're right, there is always a sort of trade-off. Every time you gain something, you're losing something else. That's how biology works. The goal of this, let's say, synergy between Trichoderma and biocontrol agents is that on one end, Trichoderma is known to reduce stressors in general into the plants. And on the other end, there are studies showing that Trichoderma is helping the plant, calling for help when the plant is attacked. That said, we need to run the test because, and as a matter of fact, we have just set the experiment. We have 42 cages in Lincoln University, 21 treated, 21 untreated. In terms of treating the plants, is very simple. We coated the seeds of tomato, and then we asked Zealandia to grow them normally. First of all, we have noticed that plants treated with Trichoderma seems to be higher. Like by the 3rd week, they get higher than the plant which are not treated by Trichoderma. The experiment is going to start formally next week. And we are going to, we are trying to check all the possible parameters, and this is definitely something we are going to try to look into. Thank you. Is that all?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was a fascinating insight. How about a round of applause for the two Chris's and for Andrew and for Emiliano for their time today. Thank you, gentlemen. Very interesting indeed. We have finished a bit early, so there's a bit of extra networking time there, perhaps time for a coffee. And morning tea is at 10, and we're back into these breakout sessions at 10:30. Thank you.